Colorado Territory, 1873. The wind cut across the high plains like a blade, and no one in the town of Willow Creek had ever seen Dawson Tate smile. He rode in with the snow each winter, helped old Sheriff Milton maintain the borders of law, then vanished again come spring. Folks said he had no home, no kin, and no heart. Some whispered he had lost a woman once, others claimed he just never cared. But when trouble came, Dawson showed up with his rifle steady and eyes flat as river stones. Cold-hearted, they said. Reliable but cold. So when Clara Rosewell stumbled into town clutching a bundled baby to her chest, wet from the storm and face streaked with tears, no one expected Dawson to be the one who stepped forward. She came in just past dusk, boots soaked, skirts caked in mud, cheeks raw from wind. The baby, no more than 3 months old, cried weakly against her shoulder. She stopped in front of the saloon, looking too dazed to speak. Sheriff Milton stepped out from the general store, wiping his hands on a rag. "Ma'am, you all right?" Clara's voice trembled. "I need help." "Please." Before Milton could say another word, Dawson turned from where he had been tying off his horse. He looked at her, one slow glance from her pale face to the baby in her arms. Then he walked toward her with the quiet weight of a man used to storms. Clara swayed. Dawson caught her before she fell. She woke in the back room of the doctor's office, tucked beneath a wool blanket with the baby sleeping on her chest. Dawson was sitting in the corner, his hat in his hands, boots still dusted with snow. Clara blinked at him. "Where am I?" "Willow Creek." "Doctor says you and the baby'll be all right." She looked down at the baby, then back at him. "Thank you," he said nothing, just nodded once and stood to leave. "Wait," she said, sitting up. "Please, I do not know where else to go." Dawson paused, his back to her. She swallowed hard. "I ran. From a man who was going to sell me and my baby to pay his debts. He is not her father, he never was, but he thought he owned us." Dawson turned slowly. His face stayed unreadable. "I will work," Clara said quickly. "I can sew, cook, clean anything. I just need somewhere safe." He stared at her a long moment, then spoke, voice rough. "Name?" "Clara Rosewell, and her name's Cora." Dawson looked at the baby, then back to Clara. "You can stay at my cabin. Just until you figure out what comes next." His cabin was 2 miles out of town, tucked near a bend in the creek and half hidden by pine. It was small but solid. 2 rooms, a stone hearth, a cot in the corner, and a table with 1 chair. Dawson brought in a second chair from the barn. Clara did not ask questions. She swept floors, mended worn shirts, and kept Cora fed and warm. Dawson spent most days chopping wood or trapping along the creek. He came home quiet but never unkind. One night, Clara stood at the hearth, rocking Cora to sleep while stew bubbled behind her. Dawson sat at the table reading an old worn paper. "You do not talk much," she said softly. He looked up. "Never saw the use in it." She smiled, tired but gentle. "I used to talk all the time, before." He didn't ask before what. Instead, he said, "You're good with her." Clara glanced down at Cora, whose tiny fingers curled around the edge of her shawl. "She is all I have." Dawson's eyes stayed on her. "Do you have anyone?" she asked. He shook his head once. "Not anymore," she nodded, accepting that. Later that night, when the fire had gone low and she thought he was asleep, Clara whispered into the dark, "Thank you for helping us." Dawson, lying on a blanket near the hearth, opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling. He said nothing, but the words settled somewhere deep. Spring came slow. The snow melted from the creek banks and birds came back to the trees. Dawson built a cradle for Cora, carving her name into the wood. Clara cried when she saw it. "You did this?" she asked, fingers trailing the smooth edges. He shrugged. "Figured she'd sleep better than in a basket." Clara stared at him until he looked away. "You are not cold, Dawson." He gave a half laugh. "That what people tell you in town? They say you have no heart." He looked at her. "Do you believe that?" Clara stepped closer. No, she was standing so close now. He could smell lavender in her hair. Her eyes held no fear, just quiet strength. He had not seen eyes like that in a long time. "I think you are kind," she said, "and strong, and you saved us." He swallowed hard. "I did not do much. You gave us a home." He looked down at Cora, sleeping in the cradle he built, then back at Clara. "You deserve better," he said. Clara touched his arm. "I want this, if you'll have me." He did not say anything. He just reached up and touched her cheek, rough thumb brushing a tear she had not realized had fallen. Then he kissed her, gentle at first, as if afraid she would break, but she did not break. She leaned in, steady and sure, and kissed him back. The fire cracked beside them. Cora stirred once in her cradle, then fell still again. Dawson pulled Clara into his arms, and the man once known for his cold heart held her like she was the only warm thing he had ever known. By early June, the trees around the cabin had leafed out fully, and the creek ran swift with meltwater from the peaks. A pair of bluebirds nested in the pine stump near the back fence, and Clara had taken to humming when she hung laundry, her voice soft and almost surprised to be heard after so long without song. Dawson had built a second shelf over the hearth, not because they needed it, but because Clara had started saving seeds from wild herbs and roots she gathered nearby. She kept them in little cloth bundles, tied neatly with string. He never asked what she planned to do with them. He just carved the shelf and put it up one morning before she woke, then went outside without saying a word. That evening, Clara touched the new shelf with both hands before putting the bundles in place. "You noticed," she said, glancing at him across the firelight. He stirred the beans and nodded once. "You save things. Seemed like they needed space." She came to sit beside him. "I used to know a woman back in Missouri who taught me which plants were worth keeping. She said the land gives what it can if you listen close and don't ask too much." Dawson handed her the tin plate without looking up. "And do you listen close?" Clara smiled faintly. "I try." He didn't answer, but later that night he asked her about the plants growing near the fence line. She told him which ones healed burns, which helped with fever, and which ones to leave alone. The next morning, he came back from checking his traps with a long-stemmed mullein leaf folded carefully into his coat pocket. "Figured you'd know what to do with it," he said, setting it on the table. Clara took it gently, her eyes meeting his. "I do." Cora had begun to fuss more in the afternoons, her gums sore and her fists always in her mouth. Clara walked with her strapped to her chest, whispering lullabies that came from old memory, rocking near the porch until the baby quieted. Dawson built a small bench beside the door so she wouldn't need to stand so long. One afternoon, while the baby finally slept on a folded quilt, Clara sat at the table mending Dawson's shirt. The light through the window caught the side of his face while he sharpened his knife, and she watched his hands with quiet interest. "You always live alone?" she asked. He paused. "Since I was 16. "What happened?" "My father died that year. Mother had gone before that. I tried working with a freight team for a while, but it didn't stick. Too many men looking to drink or cheat. I took to trapping, hunting, didn't need anyone else." Clara stitched carefully. "And now," Dawson looked up. "Now I don't mind the sound of someone laughing in the morning." She threaded the needle again, her fingers steady. "I never thought I'd find a place that felt like mine, not after I left the last one." He watched her for a long moment. "You think this is yours?" "I think I want it to be." Dawson set the knife aside. "It already is." That night they sat on the porch as the sky turned the color of cooling embers. Cora slept in her cradle inside, belly full and cheeks flushed with sleep. Clara leaned against Dawson's shoulder and he reached for her hand without needing to think about it. The wind moved through the trees, slow and warm. "You ever think about marrying?" Clara asked quietly, not looking at him. He was quiet a long time before answering. "Didn't seem like something meant for me." She nodded, lips pressed together. "I used to dream of it, not the dress or the church, just the steadiness of it. A man who wouldn't leave, a home that didn't change with the seasons." Dawson turned his hand, lacing his fingers with hers. "Then maybe we should make it real." Clara looked at him, eyes wide but not in surprise. She said nothing, only leaned in and kissed him with the calm certainty of a woman who had waited long enough. And when she rested her head against his chest, Dawson wrapped his arm around her and held her close, as if the future had finally taken root in something he could believe. The wedding was held in early July, beneath a cottonwood tree where the breeze off the creek carried the scent of wet stone and wild mint. They stood together in front of Reverend Harlan, who came up from the church in Willow Creek with a Bible and a cup of well water to bless the ground they stood on. No crowd, no ribboned pews, just Clara, Dawson, baby Cora nestled against Clara's chest, and the slow, honest rhythm of the land around them. Afterward, Clara laid her palm over Dawson's chest as if anchoring herself to something living and solid. "You sure?" Dawson had asked her that morning, brow furrowed as he adjusted the cuffs of his only clean shirt. Clara had tilted her head. "You already built me a home. Might as well make it a name too." Now, 3 weeks on, Clara kept a strip of muslin tied around her ring finger. She had sewn it herself, until Dawson could carve a band from silver he'd traded for in town. He'd started shaping it in the evenings after supper, working slow with his pocket knife and the whetstone, the same way he did everything: careful, deliberate, never rushed. That morning, Clara sat on the porch with a basket of damp shirts and Dawson's worn hat tossed beside her. Cora lay on a blanket in the shade, one hand curled by her ear. The child had started laughing lately, soft, hiccuping bursts that came and went without warning, like sparrows fluttering from a thicket. Dawson stepped out of the barn, sleeves rolled and sweat darkening his collar. He wiped his hands on his trousers and looked out toward the tree line before turning to Clara. "Got word from Milton yesterday. There's a family up toward Rabbit Ridge, lost their roof in the last storm. Figured I'd ride out and help patch it." Clara folded a shirt and set it aside. "How far?" "2 days there and back. 3 if it turns muddy." She nodded slowly, eyes on his face. "I'll be all right here." Dawson stepped up onto the porch and crouched beside Cora, brushing his fingers gently along her belly. "I know." Clara watched him, her mouth softening. "You always help folks." He glanced up. "Not always, just stopped avoiding it." She reached over and touched his jaw, thumb brushing the stubble along his cheek. "Ride careful." He leaned into her palm for the briefest second, then kissed her hand. "I will." That afternoon, after he rode out, Clara dug up the last of the late spring carrots behind the house. She worked in silence, dirt under her nails, her apron pulled tight over her middle. When Cora stirred in the cradle Dawson had built, Clara wiped her hands on her skirt and lifted the baby, pressing her close. "You and me," she murmured. "We've done harder days than this." Inside, she lit a lamp before sundown and boiled dried beans with a bit of smoked pork Dawson had left in the larder. She fed Cora, then set her in the cradle and rocked it with her foot while she sewed a new hem on Dawson's only good trousers. On the second night, a knock came at the door just after dusk. Clara stiffened, her hand pausing above a folded blanket. She rose quietly, moved to the window, and peered out. It was Sheriff Milton, hat in hand. Clara opened the door halfway. "Something wrong?" "No, ma'am," he said gently. "Just passing through on the way back from the canyon. Thought I'd check you had enough firewood." She eased the door open, stepping aside. "We're fine, but thank you." Milton stepped up just enough to glance around the room. "He left you with what you need. He always makes sure we've got more than enough." Milton tugged at his collar, eyes resting on baby Cora. "Never figured I'd see Dawson Tate settle, let alone smile at a child." Clara gave a quiet laugh. "Neither did he." Milton looked at her then, something respectful in the set of his shoulders. "You've done him good." She didn't answer, only nodded once. After he left, Clara sat beside the cradle and sang a tune her mother had once hummed over a wash tub. Cora blinked up at her, eyes wide and dark as river stone. Clara leaned down and kissed her brow. "He'll be back by Sunday," she whispered. "He always keeps his word." And he was. He rode in before noon, boots caked in clay and shirt streaked with sun. Clara opened the door before he reached the steps. He stopped short when he saw her, something in him loosening, like a rope uncoiling after a long haul. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his middle, pressing her face to his chest. "Storm caught me just outside the ridge," he said, voice low. "Took an extra night." "I know," she said into his shirt. "You're here now." He kissed her hair and breathed deep. Inside, Cora stirred and let out a small, insistent cry. Dawson pulled back just enough to look at her. "I'll get her." He crossed to the cradle, lifting the baby with practiced ease. She settled against him, cheek resting on his shoulder. Clara watched as Dawson walked the floor with her, humming something low and steady. Cora let out a sigh and closed her eyes. When he turned back to Clara, she was holding out her hand. "Come sit," she said. He did, and they sat together in the quiet, the three of them surrounded by the soft creak of wood and the hush of wind through pine. Dawson glanced at the muslin tied around her finger. "I finished it." She looked down. "The ring," he reached into his pocket and drew out the silver band. Not polished, not perfect, but shaped with care and fitted to her size. She slid it onto her finger without a word. Then she looked up and said, "You're not the man they used to talk about." Dawson watched the fire catch in the silver. "Maybe I never was." She leaned her head against his shoulder and he rested his cheek against her hair. Outside, the wind settled. And inside, the quiet held. By late August, the summer heat had settled into the soil like a second skin, and the air shimmered above the grass by mid-morning. Clara had taken to keeping the shutters open just wide enough for breeze but not sun, and she laid a damp cloth over Cora's cradle during the hottest hours. That morning, Dawson returned from town with a sack of flour, a coil of rope, and a folded piece of paper tucked into his vest. He handed the supplies to Clara and stood by the door, hesitant. "There's a man staying at the livery," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Came in from Kansas. Asking around about a woman and her baby." Clara set the flour on the counter without speaking. Her hands stayed still, but her shoulders had gone rigid. "He described me," she asked. "Not by name. Said he's looking for someone who left him owing a debt. Claims the child's his." Clara turned slowly. "He's lying." "I know." Dawson's voice was quiet, "but he's persistent. Milton said he's been at it for 2 days. She folded her arms, voice low and even. "He'll try to take her." Dawson stepped closer. "He won't." She looked at him then, her jaw set. "You don't know him?" "I don't need to," he said. "I know you, and I know he won't get past me." Clara stared at the floor, one hand pressed to her middle. "I never wanted to run forever. You won't have to." That night, Dawson saddled his horse and rode back to town. Clara sat by the window until the moon rose, Cora asleep against her chest. The silence stretched long, but she didn't fidget. She watched the darkness like it might answer something. Dawson returned just before dawn. He didn't wake her, but she rose when the door opened and met him with a lantern in hand. "He's gone," Dawson said. "Milton had cause to hold him. Turns out he's got charges behind him: fraud, false claims, theft across 3 counties. He won't be back." Clara exhaled once, slow and steady. "You didn't tell me last night. You needed rest, and I needed to know he wouldn't circle back." She stepped forward and touched his cheek, her fingers rough from soil and thread. "You carry more than you say," he nodded, eyes tired. "Come lie down," she whispered. They didn't speak again that morning. Dawson stretched out on the cot beside her, Cora curled between them on a folded quilt. The window was cracked enough to let in the scent of pine, and in that narrow slice of stillness they rested. Later that week, Clara stood barefoot in the creek with her skirts hiked just above her knees, holding Cora against her hip while the baby kicked at the shallows. Dawson sat on the bank, watching them with quiet amusement, a strand of sweetgrass between his teeth. "You ever think about going back east?" he asked. She looked over her shoulder. "To what?" "I don't know. People sometimes talk like there's more out there." Clara smiled faintly. "There's plenty here." Dawson leaned back on his hands. "I think so too." She stepped out of the water and came to sit beside him, her wet feet leaving prints in the dust. "I used to believe peace was something borrowed," she said. "Like it would always run out. And now, I think maybe we dug deep enough to keep it." Dawson reached over and took her hand. "You did most of the digging," she shook her head. "You built the ground." He kissed the side of her head, slow and sure, and she leaned into his shoulder. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the clearing. Cora gurgled in her sleep, tucked snug against Clara's chest, and for the first time in either of their lives, the quiet didn't feel like absence. It felt like home. By the time September settled in, the edge of summer had worn thin. Mornings came cooler now, with fog rising off the creek and the cottonwoods along the ridge beginning to pale. Clara had taken to wrapping Cora in a wool shawl before stepping outside, and Dawson added another layer of chinking to the north wall, preparing for the months ahead. They had slipped into a rhythm so quiet it almost didn't feel like effort, each day folding into the next with the kind of ease neither of them had ever known. Clara kept a small ledger now, tucked beneath the flour sack, where she marked what they had and what they'd need before the snows came. Dawson had begun trading his furs more selectively, taking only what was worth the ride and always returning before dusk. One morning, as Clara measured out cornmeal beside the hearth, Dawson came in with a bundle beneath his arm. He set it on the table and untied the twine without a word. Clara turned, wiping her hands. "What's that?" He unfolded the cloth to reveal a small wooden frame hand-planed and square with rough canvas stretched taut across it. A box of charcoal sticks lay beside it, wrapped in oilcloth. "It's not much," he said, "but I thought you might want to draw again." She stared at it, lips parted, then stepped forward and ran her fingers along the edge of the frame. "How did you know? You traced something in the dust last week, on the table. A horse, I think." He looked down. "You brushed it away before I could say anything." Clara touched the canvas, her voice low. "I used to sketch when I was a girl. My father let me have scraps of paper from his store ledger. I haven't drawn since I left Missouri." "Maybe it's time again," Dawson said. She looked at him with something too tender to speak aloud, then nodded once and pulled the frame gently into her arms. That evening, Dawson came in from stacking firewood to find Clara seated near the window, charcoal smudged on her fingers, Cora asleep in a basket at her feet. She had drawn the ridge outside, the way it looked just before the sun dipped behind it, with the pine shadows stretching long across the grass. There was a clarity to it that felt like memory made visible. He crouched beside her and studied it. "That's how it feels, too," she glanced at him. "Feels like home." They didn't need words after that. He reached for her hand, smudged and warm, and kissed her knuckles without hesitation. The following week, Dawson took Clara and Cora into town for the first time since spring. Clara wore a faded blue dress she'd let down at the hem, and Dawson had trimmed his beard close. They arrived just before noon, the wagon creaking gently beneath the weight of firewood and a few jars of Clara's blackberry preserves. People stared, but not with the suspicion that used to follow Dawson's boots. They nodded now, some with a quiet respect, others with cautious interest. "At the Mercantile, Mrs." Langley asked to hold Cora, and Clara obliged, watching the older woman cradle the child with a kind of practiced reverence. On their way out, Milton tipped his hat. "Didn't expect to see you both in town together." "We've got things to trade," Clara said, her tone mild. Milton looked to Dawson. "You keeping her busy?" "She keeps herself busy," Dawson said. "I just try to keep up." Milton chuckled. "Well, you're doing something right. She looks settled." That night, back at the cabin, Dawson lit a candle while Clara tucked Cora in beside the hearth. They ate supper in quiet, the kind that didn't need filling. Afterward, Dawson reached into the top drawer of the little writing desk he'd built last winter and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He passed it to Clara. "It's nothing official. Just something I wrote down." She opened it and read carefully. It was a deed transfer drawn up in Dawson's careful hand, naming her part owner of the land and cabin. Her breath caught. "You don't have to do this." "I want to," he said. "You've made it yours already." "Just makes it true on paper." She folded the deed and held it to her chest for a moment before laying it down. "You know I'd stay without it." "I know," he said. "That's why I want you to have it." As autumn deepened, they added another room to the cabin. Clara suggested it quietly, one morning while they shelled beans at the table. Dawson nodded without question, and within days, he'd started cutting timbers. She helped him fit the beams, her hands calloused now, her strength steady. By October, the new room stood finished small and square, with a window that faced the creek. It would be Cora's, once she grew out of the cradle. Clara hung a strip of blue calico across the window pane and placed a quilt over the cot. Dawson carved a small wooden horse for the shelf, its edges smooth with care. On the final night before the first frost, they sat outside beneath a sky thick with stars. Clara leaned against Dawson's side, her head just below his shoulder. Cora lay bundled in a basket beside them, cheeks pink with sleep. "I don't need more than this," Clara said, voice barely above a whisper. Dawson looked out at the land, the ridge, the creek that traced their days. "Neither do I." She turned to him, her eyes soft in the starlight. "You gave me a life I never dared to hope for." He reached up and tucked her hair behind her ear. "You gave it shape." She kissed him slowly with quiet certainty. No rush, no fear. Just the long, steady truth of love built with hands and time. When they rose, he carried Cora inside while Clara banked the fire. They closed the door behind them, warmth already rising from the stones. And in the cabin they'd made their own, with rooms that held laughter and walls that had heard their quiet vows. They lay down together, husband and wife, father and mother. Two people who had weathered the long dark and found the dawn. The winter would come, as it always did. But the fire inside would hold. And when spring returned, it would find them still there, rooted, steady and holy, completely home.